The smell of roasted pine and baked ham used to mean family, but this Christmas it just meant I had a lot of cleaning to do. I wiped down the granite countertops of my own kitchen, listening to my daughter-in-law Sarah complain about the brand of napkins I had bought. 3 years ago, when my husband passed away, I made the mistake of letting my son David and his wife move into my 4-bedroom house. They claimed they needed to save for their own place. Instead, they slowly took over mine. I moved into the downstairs master suite to give them privacy, thinking I was being a supportive mother. I was 64, healthy and perfectly capable of living alone, but I loved having my family close. However, the boundaries blurred quickly. Sarah began redecorating the living room, boxing up my memories without asking. David, always passive and eager to avoid conflict, just shrugged when I brought it up. I didn't argue. I simply observed. I watched as they treated my home like a free hotel, leaving dishes in the sink and expecting me to manage the utilities. I wasn't a weak woman, and I didn't cry over the lost authority. But I was getting tired. I had a clear limit, and they were inching closer to it every single day. The front door swung open, bringing a gust of freezing winter air and the overpowering scent of expensive floral perfume. Beatrice, Sarah's mother, had arrived for the holidays. She stepped into the foyer, wearing a faux fur coat, handing her luggage to David without a word of thanks. She glanced around my hallway, her nose wrinkling slightly, as if the air wasn't quite up to her standards. I wiped my hands on a towel, taking a slow, deep breath. I should have known that letting Beatrice stay under my roof for a week was going to push me over the edge. Beatrice walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She didn't offer a hug or a warm greeting. Instead, her eyes scanned my faded, comfortable wool sweater and my practical jeans. "Kathleen," she greeted, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Still doing all the chores, I see. Sarah told me you just love keeping busy." I didn't flinch. I just smiled, politely folding the dish towel. "I like keeping my house in order, Beatrice. Welcome." Sarah hurried in, immediately offering her mother a glass of imported wine that I had paid for. The dynamic in the house shifted instantly. With Beatrice around, Sarah became bolder, more demanding. They sat at the kitchen island, gossiping about people I didn't know, completely ignoring my presence while waiting for me to serve the appetizers. I realized then that they saw me not as the homeowner, but as the live-in help. Instead of getting angry, I simply stopped. I picked up my book from the counter, poured myself a cup of tea, and walked toward my downstairs suite. "Oh, Kathleen, aren't you going to put the roast in?" Sarah called out, sounding genuinely confused. "I'm off the clock," I replied, calmly, not looking back. "The oven works just fine if you turn the dial." I heard a sharp scoff from Beatrice as I closed my door. Let them cook. I had my own space, my own bank accounts, and my own peace of mind. I spent the evening reading, ignoring the clattering of pots and the eventual smell of slightly burnt meat. Later that night, a soft knock came at my door. It was my 8-year-old granddaughter, Lily. She slipped into my room holding a plate of cookies. We sat on my bed, eating in comfortable silence, far away from the tension upstairs. But the real trouble started when Beatrice decided to rearrange my dining room. Christmas Eve morning brought a new level of audacity. I walked upstairs to find my antique dining table completely cleared. The hand-stitched table runner my late husband bought in Italy was gone, replaced by a stark, modern silver centerpiece. Beatrice was adjusting a crystal glass, looking incredibly pleased with herself. The old lace was just too dusty. "Kathleen," Beatrice announced before I could even speak, "we're going for a clean, modern aesthetic for tomorrow's dinner. I put your little cloth in a plastic bag in the garage." My jaw tightened. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a fit. I simply walked out to the garage, retrieved the bag, and carried it straight into my suite. When I returned, David was in the kitchen sipping coffee and scrolling on his phone. "Your mother-in-law is redecorating my house." "David." I stated, keeping my voice level. He didn't even look up. Just let them have this, Mom. It's just for the holiday. Don't make a big deal out of it. His passive attitude was worse than Sarah's control. I watched my son realizing how soft he had become, how willing he was to let me be disrespected, just so he didn't have to deal with his wife's temper. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with an alert from my bank. A charge for $500 at a luxury boutique down the street. I had given David my emergency credit card to buy extra groceries. I walked up to him holding out my hand. My card. Now. David blinked, startled. Mom, Sarah just needed to grab a few nice gifts for her mom. I'll pay you back. The card, David. I repeated my tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. He nervously fished it out of his wallet and handed it over. I slipped it into my pocket, walked away, and immediately opened my banking app to lock the account. It was time to cut the purse strings, but I didn't realize how soon I'd need to tighten the knot. Christmas Day arrived with a thick layer of snow outside and a thick layer of tension inside. The house smelled amazing, mostly because I had baked my own small turkey in my sweets kitchenette, knowing better than to rely on Sarah's chaotic cooking schedule. By 4 o'clock, the main dining room was a flurry of activity. Sarah had dressed in a silk dress, and Beatrice wore a tailored suit covered in pearls. I wore a clean-pressed burgundy blouse and black trousers, comfortable, dignified, but apparently not up to their standards. I walked into the dining room to find the seating arrangements already established by Beatrice. She had placed herself at the head of the table. David was at the other end. Sarah was seated next to her mother, and Lily was placed directly across from them. There was only one seat left for me. It was at the very end of the long table, squeezed uncomfortably close to the swinging kitchen door, practically in the hallway. We put you near the kitchen, Kathleen. Beatrice smiled smoothly, adjusting her napkin. Since you'll probably be getting up a lot to fetch the side dishes, it just makes logistical sense. I stared at the chair. I owned the table, the chairs, the floor they sat on, and the roof over their heads. Yet I was being placed like a servant. I didn't argue. I pulled out the chair and sat down, my posture perfectly straight. I caught Lily's eye. My granddaughter looked uncomfortable picking at the hem of her dress. She gave me a small, sad smile, which I returned. David sat down, avoiding eye contact with me entirely. He was a coward, hiding behind the women who ran his life. The food was brought out, mostly store-bought catering they had ordered at the last minute, and the wine was poured. I remained quiet, observing the dynamics, silently planning my next steps. Then Beatrice looked at my plate and sneered. You know, Kathleen, I recently read an article about how people on fixed incomes manage their holidays. Beatrice began cutting a piece of dry turkey. It's really inspiring how you make do with so little. Shopping at discount stores, wearing last season's clothes. It builds character. Sarah giggled quietly into her wine glass. David suddenly found his mashed potatoes fascinating, refusing to look up. I set my fork down gently. I am perfectly comfortable, Beatrice. Wealth isn't always something you wear on your sleeve. Sometimes it's just knowing you don't owe anyone a dime. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. She didn't like being challenged, especially by someone she deemed beneath her. Well, some of us prefer to maintain a certain standard of living. My late husband made sure I would never have to worry about pinching pennies or living in a basement. It's a master suite, I corrected calmly. And it's in the house that I own. The house your daughter currently lives in, rent-free. The table went dead silent. Sarah's face flushed bright red. Kathleen, there is no need to be rude, she hissed, clearly embarrassed that her mother was being reminded of their financial reality. Truth isn't rude, Sarah, I replied, taking a sip of water. It's just the truth. Beatrice's face tightened into an ugly scowl. Her fake superiority was slipping, replaced by raw, defensive anger. She hated that I wasn't intimidated by her pearls or her attitude. She hated that I wouldn't cast my eyes down and play the grateful poor mother-in-law. She leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave. "You think you're so smart sitting here in your cheap clothes? You're nothing but a burden to them." I didn't flinch. I just smiled, a small, knowing smile that infuriated her even more. I never expected a woman in a cashmere sweater to resort to violence. "Clear the plates." Kathleen, Beatrice suddenly demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. "We are ready for dessert." I looked at her entirely unbothered. "If you want dessert, Beatrice, the kitchen is right through that door. Feel free to fetch it yourself." Beatrice's face turned a violent shade of purple. The illusion of high society manners completely shattered. She slammed her hands on the table and stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood. Before anyone could blink, she marched over to my end of the table. I thought she was going to scream in my face, but instead, she raised her hand and struck me. The slap echoed through the dining room with a sharp cracking sound. My head snapped to the side, my cheek instantly burning from the impact of her heavy rings. At Christmas, my DIL's mother slapped me and yelled, "Poor people eat outside." Her words rang in the air, vicious and unhinged. She stood over me, chest heaving, pointing toward the back door. Everyone froze. The silence was absolute, suffocating. I slowly turned my head back to look at her. I didn't raise my hand to my cheek. I didn't shed a single tear. I just stared at her with ice in my veins. I shifted my gaze to David, my son. He was pale, gripping the edge of the table. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to defend his mother, to kick this woman out of my house. "Mom," David stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. Just apologize to her. Please, let's not ruin Christmas. Just go to your room for a bit." My heart turned to stone. He wasn't just passive. He was completely broken. I looked at my son, realizing the boy I raised was gone. Before I could even process David's absolute betrayal, I heard the scraping of another chair. Lily, my 8-year-old granddaughter, stood up. She didn't look scared. She didn't look like a child caught in a nightmare. She looked exactly like her grandfather used to look when he saw a grave injustice. She walked around the large table, her little dress swishing, and stepped right between Beatrice and me. Everyone looked away until my 8-year-old granddaughter stood up, stared her down, and said one sentence that left the whole family speechless. Lily tilted her chin up, locking eyes with the towering, furious woman. Her voice was crystal clear, without a single shake. "This is Grandma's house," Lily stated, pointing her small finger directly at the front door. "You are the bad guest, so you are the one who has to leave." The heavy silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of absolute shock. Beatrice took a step back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She looked at Sarah, expecting her daughter to discipline the child. "Lily, go to your room right now," Sarah finally shrieked, finding her voice. "No," Lily replied simply. She crossed her arms and planted her feet firmly beside my chair. She was a tiny fortress of truth in a room full of cowards. Beatrice tried to laugh, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Well, children these days, absolutely zero respect." She turned to David. "Are you going to let her speak to me like that?" David looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was paralyzed by his own weakness. But I wasn't going to let my granddaughter fight my battles. I stood up, slowly pushing my chair in. I placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder, silently thanking her. Then I turned my full attention to the adults. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Beatrice, I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack your bags and get out of my house. If you are not gone, you will be standing in the snow without a coat. Sarah jumped up. You can't kick my mother out on Christmas. Watch me, I replied. I walked over to the hallway console table. I opened the drawer and pulled out the spare set of keys to the SUV. David drove the car that was fully registered in my name. I dropped them into my pocket. Then I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and canceled the joint checking account I used to pay their utility bills. I did it right in front of them, tapping the screen with deliberate precision. Mom, what are you doing? David asked, panic finally breaking through his cowardice. I am taking my life back, David. I answered without looking up. I allowed you to live here to help you. Instead, you treated me like a servant, and you sat silently while a guest assaulted me in my own dining room. It was just a misunderstanding. Sarah pleaded, her eyes darting between me and her mother, who was now nervously inching toward the hallway. No, it was a revelation, I corrected. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and pulled it wide open. The freezing air rushed in. I pointed outside. 10 minutes, Beatrice, or I lock the doors and keep your luggage. They thought I was bluffing until I walked to the breaker box. Sarah tried to argue, stepping between her mother and the door. I didn't debate her. I walked straight to the utility closet in the hallway, opened the gray metal panel of the breaker box, and flipped the main switches for the upper floors. The dining room chandelier died. The Christmas tree lights went black. The house was plunged into sudden dark silence. Dinner is over, I announced into the darkness. That was the breaking point. Beatrice scrambled upstairs in the dark, using her phone flashlight, returning a few minutes later, dragging her suitcase. She didn't look at me as she scurried out the front door into the freezing night, calling an Uber from the driveway. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. David and Sarah stood in the dark hallway, looking completely lost. Turn the power back on, Mom, David begged, rubbing his face. We can talk about this tomorrow. We will talk. I agreed, flipping the switches back on. The lights flickered back to life, illuminating their terrified faces. You both have 30 days to find a new place to live. The car stays here. The credit cards are cut off. You pay for your own food, your own gas, and your own lives starting right now. You can't do this to us, Sarah shouted, dropping her facade entirely. Where are we supposed to go? You're adults. Figure it out, I replied. I looked down at Lily, who was still standing quietly by the wall. I knelt down and hugged her tightly. She hugged me back, burying her face in my shoulder. The hardest part wasn't packing them up. It was knowing how much the transition would affect Lily. The next 30 days were a lesson in reality for David and Sarah. Without my financial padding, they realized how expensive the real world was. They couldn't afford a house in my neighborhood. They ended up signing a lease on a cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town. I didn't help them pack. I didn't offer to pay their security deposit. Every time David tried to approach me with sad eyes, I simply handed him an empty moving box. He had made his choice when he let Beatrice strike me, and I was making mine. I was done being a safety net for people who didn't respect me. The day they moved out, the house felt massive. I walked upstairs, pulling down the modern curtains Sarah had installed, and opened the windows to let the crisp air in. I moved my things back into the master bedroom upstairs. I hired a cleaner to scrub away the lingering smell of Beatrice's cheap floral perfume. I didn't cut them out of my life entirely. I couldn't do that to Lily. I arranged to pick Lily up from school twice a week, and she spent most weekends with me. David dropped her off, keeping his head down, mumbling polite pleasantries. Sarah refused to look me in the eye. That was fine with me. I didn't need their apologies because I knew they were only sorry they lost their free ride. My home was quiet now, but it wasn't lonely. It was mine. I sat in my antique dining chair sipping tea, watching Lily draw pictures at the table. I didn't need lawsuits or dramatic family interventions. I just needed my boundaries, my keys, and the peace that came with knowing my worth.